Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Imagine having like a really bad skin disease, something that's just making you miserable, and you have to go through weeks of treatment.
Yeah.
And you're feeling awful from the side effects the whole time, but you're holding on to hope, and then you get the news that it hasn't worked.
Right.
For almost 1 million people every year, this is the reality they face with cutaneous leishmaniasis,
Yeah.
which is a parasitic skin infection, and it's a really tough situation to be in.
It really is a huge global health problem.
Yeah.
This infection caused by the Leishmania parasite is found in many tropical and subtropical regions,
Right?
and it often affects communities that are already struggling with things like malnutrition and displacement.
Right?
And it's not just the physical illness.
Yeah.
It can leave people with scars that last a lifetime, and there's also a big social stigma associated with it.
Oh, wow.
A major challenge is that we don't have a vaccine for it.
Yep.
And the treatments that are available often aren't very effective. They can have really bad side effects.
Right. Yeah.
And they can be difficult to administer.
Yeah, it sounds like a really tough situation all around. So with all of that in mind, what if there was a way to know right at the beginning of your treatment
Right.
if it was likely to work for you or not?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to dive into today.
Exactly.
We're taking a look at a new study published in Nature Communications
Yep.
that offers a potential breakthrough in predicting treatment success for cutaneous leishmaniasis.
Right.
And this could really help people avoid going through weeks or even months of these ineffective and toxic treatments. So for this deep dive, our goal is to explore how this new research can provide a more direct path to effective treatment
Exactly.
for this really challenging disease.
Right.
And to understand how it could lead to a more personalized approach to managing it.
Yes.
So let's unpack this study a little bit.
Okay.
Can you tell me what exactly were the researchers trying to figure out here?
The main aim was to develop a way to predict if a patient with cutaneous leishmaniasis would respond to the most common treatment, which is a drug called meglumine antimoniate.
Okay.
It's kind of like the first-line drug that's used, but unfortunately it has a pretty high failure rate.
Right. So why is it so important to know early on whether or not this treatment is likely to work?
Well, like we said, this standard drug fails in a lot of patients,
Right.
somewhere between 40 and 70% of patients.
Oh, wow. That's a huge number.
Yeah.
I mean, are we talking about people who maybe try it for a few weeks and it doesn't work? Or...
No, it can be after a full 14-week course of treatment.
Wow. So that's over 3 months of taking this drug and it's still not working.
Exactly.
That's a lot of time and money wasted.
Yes, and not to mention the side effects.
Right, because you're feeling awful the whole time you're taking this.
Yeah, it can be really tough on patients.
So how did the researchers go about trying to solve this problem?
Okay, so the researchers were from the University of Maryland and the Centro Internacional de Entrenamiento e Investigaciones Médicas
Okay.
in Colombia.
Okay.
And they conducted a study with 40 adult patients who had cutaneous leishmaniasis.
Okay.
And they took blood samples from these patients at 3 different times during their treatment with meglumine antimoniate at the start,
Okay.
midway through.
Okay.
And at the end,
Right.
they also took biopsies of the skin lesions before the treatment began.
Okay, so they were looking at the blood and the actual lesions themselves.
Right.
So what did they do with these samples that could help predict treatment outcomes?
They focused on specific types of immune cells in the blood.
Okay.
So monocytes,
Okay.
which are kind of like the surveillance team of your immune system.
Right.
Neutrophils,
Okay.
which are often the first responders to an infection.
Okay.
And eosinophils, which play a role in fighting parasites.
Okay.
And they used a technique called transcriptomic profiling.
So what is that exactly?
It's essentially getting a snapshot of all the activity that's happening inside those immune cells.
Oh.
You can think of it as like reading the instruction manual that the cells are currently following
Okay.
to see which genes are active and which ones are quiet.
Interesting.
And they also use machine learning to try and find patterns in this gene activity that could predict how well someone would respond to the treatment.
So they're using some pretty high-tech stuff here.
Yeah, it's pretty advanced.
So what were some of the key things that they discovered?
Well, the most crucial finding was that patients who didn't respond to the meglumine antimoniate treatment,
Right.
they showed a sustained type 1 interferon response.
Okay, can you explain what that means?
Sure. So the type 1 interferon response is kind of like your body's initial alarm system against a viral intruder.
Okay.
It triggers the production of signaling molecules that help fight off the virus.
Right.
However, in cutaneous leishmaniasis, If this response stays elevated for too long, it actually seems to disrupt the normal healing process.
Oh.
And it can interfere with the effectiveness of the drug.
So it's like your body's own defenses are working against the treatment.
Exactly. It's like a misdirected immune response.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the researchers observed this elevated type 1 interferon response in all 3 types of immune cells that they analyzed.
So it's happening across the board.
Yeah, it was a consistent pattern.
Interesting. So this is where the ability to predict treatment response comes in.
Right.
They found a way to look at this type 1 interferon response and tell if the treatment was likely to work.
Exactly, by analyzing the activity levels of just 9 specific genes.
9 genes?
Yeah, just 9.
Wow.
That are part of this type 1 interferon response.
Okay.
They were able to predict with 90% accuracy whether the treatment would be effective.
90%? That's incredibly accurate.
Yeah, it's really impressive.
So that means that almost every patient could know right away if this treatment is likely to help them.
That's the goal.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it could be a real game changer.
So what could this mean for how we treat this disease in the future?
Well, this kind of biomarker-based prediction could really change how healthcare providers approach treating cutaneous leishmaniasis.
Right.
It could allow doctors to identify very early on if the standard treatment is unlikely to work for a particular patient.
And that would save so much time and suffering for the patient.
Exactly. Instead of putting someone through weeks of treatment that won't work, they could know right away and move on to other options.
Right, and avoid all of those awful side effects, too.
Exactly.
So if the standard treatment isn't going to work, what happens then?
Well, identifying those non-responders early means they can be switched to alternative treatments much more quickly.
Okay.
And this could lead to faster healing, reduce the risk of permanent scarring,
Right.
and ultimately improve their quality of life much sooner.
So it's really about getting people the right treatment as quickly as possible.
That's the idea.
It sounds like this is moving towards a more personalized medicine approach for this disease.
Absolutely. It's all about tailoring treatment to the individual patient.
And this could be especially important given that the study mentions the disease potentially spreading to new regions like the United States.
Right.
So having this kind of predictive tool could become even more vital.
Yeah, absolutely. As the geographic range of the disease expands,
Right.
having tools that can quickly and accurately guide treatment decisions is going to be really crucial.
Absolutely.
Especially for healthcare systems in these new areas where they may not be as familiar with the disease.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's about getting people the right care as quickly as possible,
Right.
no matter where they are.
But with any new research, there are always limitations.
Of course.
So what are some of the things to keep in mind about this study?
Well, one limitation is that the current test requires sophisticated laboratory equipment.
Okay.
And this kind of technology may not be readily available in resource-limited settings,
Right.
which are often the places where cutaneous leishmaniasis is most prevalent.
So that's a bit of a catch-22. The people who need this test the most may not have access to it.
Yeah, that's a challenge.
But hopefully that's something that can be addressed in the future.
Yeah, the research team is actually working on developing a more portable and user-friendly version of the test that could be used in the field.
That would be great.
Yeah,
So that would make it more accessible to people in those resource-limited settings.
exactly.
What are some other limitations?
Another thing to keep in mind is that this study focused specifically on predicting response to meglumine antimoniate,
Okay.
which is the standard treatment.
Right.
But more research might be needed to see if these same biomarkers are also useful for predicting response to other treatments.
Right. So for now, it's really just focused on this one particular drug.
Yes, but it's a good starting point,
Yeah.
and hopefully future research will expand on this.
And hopefully it will be applicable to other treatments as well.
Exactly.
Are there any other limitations we should be aware of?
Well, the researchers noted that the machine learning models they used showed really good predictive power.
Right.
But machine learning techniques in general benefit from larger amounts of data.
Okay.
So as more data becomes available, the accuracy of these predictions could potentially be further refined.
That's kind of an ongoing process.
Yeah, it's always evolving.
So it's a really promising start, but there's still more work to be done.
Exactly.
That's how science works.
Right.
So what are the experts saying about this breakthrough?
There are some really great quotes from the lead researchers,
Okay.
Maria Adelaida Gomez,
Okay.
a microbiologist at CDM,
Okay.
and co-lead author of the study.
Okay.
She talked about the difficult reality of the current treatments,
Right.
saying, it's commonly said that the cure can be worse than the disease.
Ooh.
This is very true with our current treatments for cutaneous leishmaniasis.
Yeah.
She really emphasized how toxic the drugs are and how uncertain their effectiveness is. And she highlighted the significant impact that this has on patients in countries like Colombia.
So she's speaking from experience.
Yeah, she sees the effects of this firsthand.
And it can be pretty devastating for people.
It really can be.
So this new research offers a real glimmer of hope.
Yeah, definitely.
That things could be different in the future.
Exactly.
What else did the experts have to say?
Well, Najib El-Sayed, a professor at the University of Maryland,
Okay.
and the other co-lead author,
Okay.
he stressed the high failure rate of the standard drug,
Right.
saying that it fails in about 40 to 70% of patients, even after they complete the full course of treatment.
Wow.
Which is really discouraging.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And he emphasized the importance of early prediction.
Right.
To prevent prolonged ineffective treatment.
Right.
And to help patients get access to more suitable alternatives sooner.
Yeah.
So he's really advocating for a more personalized approach.
Absolutely.
Where treatment is tailored to the individual patient.
Right.
Based on their likelihood of responding to a particular drug.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Anything else from the experts?
El-Sayed also pointed out that this research is one of the first real attempts to translate laboratory findings into practical applications for this disease.
Interesting.
So it's not just theoretical.
Right.
It has the potential to really make a difference in people's lives.
That's great.
Yeah, it's a big step forward.
And it's really exciting to see this kind of progress being made.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like the experts are really enthusiastic about this research and its potential to improve treatment for cutaneous leishmaniasis.
Yeah, they're definitely hopeful.
And that's really encouraging for patients who are struggling with this disease.
It is. It gives them hope for a better future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I'd like to encourage them to think about the broader implications of this research.
Okay.
What if this kind of personalized approach,
Right,
where we use biomarkers to predict treatment response, became the norm for a wide range of diseases?
wow.
Not just cutaneous leishmaniasis.
That would be incredible.
Yeah, it'd be a huge shift in how we approach healthcare.
Absolutely.
It would mean that treatment could be tailored to each individual patient
Right.
based on their own unique biology.
Yeah.
And that could lead to much better outcomes for everyone.
That's a really thought-provoking idea.
Yeah, something to think about.
If people want to learn more about cutaneous leishmaniasis and the efforts to combat it, where should they go?
They could check out the work of organizations like the World Health Organization,
Okay.
which is actively involved in addressing neglected tropical diseases like this one.
Right.
And it's also important to acknowledge the collaborative effort behind this research,
Yeah.
which involved teams at the University of Maryland and CDIAM in Colombia.
Right.
It's a great example of global scientific collaboration.
Absolutely.
And it shows what can be accomplished when people from different countries work together.
So the takeaway from today's deep dive is that this research represents a really significant step towards a future where treatment for cutaneous leishmaniasis can be more precise, less toxic, and ultimately much more effective.
Exactly. And that's a really hopeful message for patients and their families.
Absolutely. It's a reason to be optimistic about the future of treatment for this disease.
Yeah, I think so.
And I think that's a great note to end on.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.